force is something that is often used to get all kinds of other goals, right? This is why realists stress power and military power as being so important to states. Because we don't only fight wars to defend ourselves, and we don't always use force to fight wars. The idea we want to get at here comes from this famous 19th century Prussian military historian and thinker named Karl von Clausewitz, that war is a mere continuation of politics by other means. And this has often been, I think, misinterpreted as saying, war is no big deal, it's just politics by other means. Clausewitz is saying quite the opposite. What he's saying is that war, even though it's this incredibly violent and sometimes seems uncontrolled, unlimited activity, war has political goals. And the ways that we fight wars and the reasons we fight wars always have to be linked to the political goals that they're meant to serve. Otherwise, they're counterproductive. And really what we're focused on now is how not just war, but the threat of war is useful in politics. And this is a key point, really, that I want to stress. So force and bargaining go together like a hand in a glove. They're two sides of the same coin. Almost every use of force is an attempt at bargaining, right? Sometimes maybe a country is just going to take some territory and not bother asking about it, much as Russia did with Crimea. But much, much, much more often, the use of military force is aimed at getting some other side, right, to agree to something, which is why wars almost always end with negotiated solutions, right, even if they're very one-sided. But more to the point, even when we're not quote-unquote using force, that is to say, even when we're not actually dropping bombs and shooting people, the fact that we could, if we have enough airplanes and bullets and missiles and so on, the fact that we could is always intended to shape the way other people bargain with us. Right? So, again, in almost every war, you think about how horrible World War I was and how horrible World War II were. Well, ultimately, those were still negotiations. Right? We were trying to get the other side to surrender, and the other side was trying to get us to surrender. There are some wars of extermination. Think about some of the wars conducted against the Plains Indians in this country. There are genocides. But again, most of the time, war involves a negotiation. The flip side of that is almost all bargaining, or a lot of bargaining and negotiation, carries an implied threat of force in the form of the question, what happens if we don't agree? Right? So this is kind of the opposite side, or a different element of the whole steps to war explanation. Right? You always want the other side to be thinking, if we don't resolve this, this could end up in war. And presumably they don't want it to end up in war, so they're more likely to do what it is that you want. So we often think of war is the end of negotiation or the opposite of negotiation, but I'm trying to convince you that either war or the threat of it or the implied threat of it just by owning weapons is in fact tightly merged together with negotiation and bargaining. How do you strike good bargains? Well, you strike good bargains by ensuring that the other side wants to make a deal more than you do, right? This is true whether you're buying a used car or whether you're negotiating with the Tsarist Russia over where the border is going to be between Prussia and Russia. You want them to want to deal more than you do, which means they have to fear or see the cost or danger of a non-agreement more than you do, which means, right, you want them to fear that if there's a war, you're going to win and they're going to lose. Or at least, even if they're going to win, that the cost is going to be so high that they're going to wish they had never done it. And how do you do that? You ensure that you have a strong military. Right? So this, in sum of the sum of this logic is that military strength is meant to support one's bargaining position, as well as simply to defend an actual attack. Right? Or to put it slightly differently, defense is often intended as the able to resist being coerced. Right? Because if you can defend yourself against a military attack, the threat of such an attack is less credible. So Sun Tzu, the great ancient Chinese military theorist, famously said that the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. And the idea that Sun Tzu is getting at is you want to be so much more powerful than whoever it is that you're bargaining with that they do not want to fight with you, and they will give you what you want without fighting. This is sort of the military analogy of someone just walking up to me on the street and putting a gun to my head and saying, your money or your life, right? I'm just going to give them my money, no problem. That's the goal. So a great example of this that actually also involves China is when Britain handed over Hong Kong to China in 1997. Hong Kong had been a British territory since way back in the middle of the 19th century, and in the 20th century, British basically said, you know what, China, we're going to give this to you. We're going to give it back to you. China had demanded this, of course. But why did Britain, which was a very powerful country, even armed with nuclear weapons, that had colonized this territory for 150 years, why were they willing to give it back? Well, part of it was they just looked at the map and said, if the Chinese decide that they want Hong Kong back, and they really want it back, they'll pretty much be able to take it, and we'd be left with the option of either waging a war with China that we really can't win, or certainly don't want to, or fighting a war, to put it differently, fighting a massive war with China over something that's a lot more important to them than it is to us. And so, in that case, they just said, yeah, you're done. So that brings us to this term from the nuclear deterrence theory about escalation dominance. In any kind of situation, and we talked about this when we talked about the spiral model, if one side threatens the other side doesn't just have to say, okay, I guess I should do what they want. They can make a counter threat. And the notion of escalation dominance is to try to get oneself in a position where no matter what counter threat the other side makes, you can always trump it with something bigger and better. Now, of course, that's a nice thing to have, but rarely does one actually have it. That might be one way of thinking about what hegemony is. That would be the idea that you can always do something to up the ante successfully on somebody who's trying to threaten you. Most of the time, you get in a situation where two sides can really hurt each other a lot, and there's this bluffing game to try to figure out, will they really do it? So force is necessary to resist coercion, but it also enables coercion, right? So if my goal is to resist some other country being able to coerce my country, I'm going to build up a bunch of defense. But usually, almost all military capacity, right, can be used to attack as well as to defend. So even when we're thinking, or especially when we're thinking about force as being linked to negotiation, I simply want to point out we still run into the security dilemma. So far, I've been talking about force in the sense of being able to endure pain, right? Drop bombs on others, fight against their army, and so on and so forth. But bargaining has two sides to it, and the use of force has two sides to it, right? One is how much pain can you endure on others? The other is how much pain can they endure on you, and how much pain can you put up with? So, and I stress this in the textbook, but I want to stress it again here, that a tolerance for casualties, in a strange way, is an important element of power in conflict. Because if you're unwilling to have even a single member of your military killed, it's pretty hard for you to deploy your military, right? If you're willing to get millions of your military killed, for example, the Soviet Union defending itself against Nazi Germany, right? You could fight on for a long time, and you could inflict a lot of costs on your enemy. So one of the issues that the United States faced in Vietnam, and then again in Iraq and Afghanistan, is being highly sensitive to casualties. And one of the things the United States and others have done, right, is to try to use technology to change this. To use technology so that you can inflict pain on others and inflict casualty on others without actually having to put your own people at risk. That's kind of the beauty of drones. We also might point out as one of the beauties of cyber warfare. But all of these things, right, how do you inflict losses on others, and how can they potentially inflict losses on you, and how sensitive are you and them to losses? This is all part of bargaining power. And that is a sort of in a nutshell, sort of how force relates to politics, which I'm going to argue is what force in international politics is about most of the time, because most of the time we're not actually at war with one another. We're just hinting about war.